Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 8, the Pre-Primary Education Act?
We'll now call Bill number 8, the Pre-Primary Education Act. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is with great pride and pleasure that I move for the passage of third reading for Bill number 8, the Pre-Primary Education Act. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, former U.S. President Abraham Lincoln once famously said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe." This quote obviously is in reference to the importance, Mr. Speaker, of planning and preparation. And certainly as a former educator in the Nova Scotia school system, I experienced firsthand the importance of planning and preparation. An idea is only as strong as its implementation. This is indeed a significant piece of legislation that will alter the public school program of our education system. It is critical that we get the implementation right. Early education is critical to the development of the child. Planning, preparation, and proper implementation, Mr. Speaker, are critical in the delivery of our education program. We only have to look at the implementation a decade ago of IB and O2 programs where timing was built in, capacity was built in, and even then, in the first few years of those programs, there were bumps in the road. The factors of making sure proper planning is in place, making sure consultation takes place, simply has not been the case in the rollout of pre-primary. Those factors have been lacking from the very beginning with the rushed rollout of pre-primary. Therefore, we cannot support a piece of legislation that places politics ahead of good education policy. We cannot support a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, that fails to take into account the impact on our daycare system, the impact on community groups, and fails to address the shortage of early childhood educators. Much of those issues, Mr. Speaker, could have been avoided if planning had been put in place. We cannot support putting more students into a system that is already in crisis. Mr. Speaker, I am not opposed to pre-primary in principle, but I am opposed to the implementation, the timing, and messy rollout of this program, which some have noted is simply a tactic by this government to distract Nova Scotians from the real issues that must be addressed now in order to create stability in the education system. As I stated, Mr. Speaker, during second reading on Bill 8, is it right to add a new program to our public school program when the system is already destabilized and requires the immediate attention and leadership of the government? So let's be specific, Mr. Speaker. Let's discuss education policy for a few moments. Rather than implementing pre-primary at this time, the government should be devoting its energy and resources to addressing the gaps in our inclusion model, making that a priority. Just the other day, Mr. Speaker, I fielded a phone call from a very concerned parent. This parent has 2 children with autism. The youngest has been identified along with autism with ADHD and phonetic challenges. It took 2 years for an evaluation through the school board. The parent had to pay for a private evaluation. That's not my Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The education system needs to reinforce the principle of equality of opportunity. With all these challenges, there is also no program assistant assigned to these students. What is offered instead is release time from the class to go to the Learning Centre. In my 13-year career as a classroom teacher, I saw time and time again inclusion simply being a theory and not something that was emphasized in practice. We need to get serious about that, Mr. Speaker. We need to begin now. We need to make that a priority, and we must emphasize it. So therefore, what should this government be doing? They should be focusing on the inclusion model, Mr. Speaker. They should be expanding and strengthening EIBI. They should be working with school boards to improve communication with parents so that parents understand clearly the expectations and outcomes in IPPs. Mr. Speaker, teachers in our province support the principle of inclusion. What they need are more programming supports. They need better resources to implement the outcomes of IPPs. The money that has been invested, our priority would have been to invest that money into programming and teaching assistants. There is so much potential for that role to assist our diverse learners. At the moment, Mr. Speaker, many of our program assistants, teaching assistants, what they receive for training before they go into the classroom is first aid, WHMIS, nonviolent crisis intervention, which is all very good, but we could be making strategic investments for them so that they can deliver better programming for our students. Mr. Speaker, the list of identified issues in our education system can go on and on. And unfortunately, this government I encourage this government to begin rolling up their sleeves and getting to work on those identified problems. If you take a look, Mr. Speaker, and talk to teachers and parents, they'll tell you we need more mental health supports in all our schools, just not the family of schools. We need curriculum reform. I believe, Mr. Speaker, we need to strengthen our O2 program by expanding more vocational options within that program. This, I believe, Mr. Speaker, would help address attendance issues that we are seeing specifically in our high schools. I'm a firm believer, Mr. Speaker, we need to strengthen the principle of equality of opportunity in our schools. In the span of my career, it was always very unfortunate to see students who were subjected to obstacles through no fault of their own in order to achieve the outcomes because they didn't have the necessary supplies or resources. Mr. Speaker, the government's attention needs to be on the teacher shortage. In Metro, we do not have enough substitute teachers. Now, I will commend the government for the class caps, but again, they fail on implementation, not factoring in, Mr. Speaker, the operational impact of a policy this goes along as well, Mr. Speaker, with a shortage of core and immersion teachers. And Mr. Speaker, the emphasis of this government needs to be on repairing the severed and damaged relationships with its teachers, program assistants. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, only a few months ago, teachers and parents and program assistants were very vocal, and they took to the streets in protest over the learning conditions in our classrooms. They were expecting action. They were expecting this government to get to work on addressing those issues. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that I was a part of that educational unrest. And I speak to the House not from the perspective of theory or any abstract notion of education, but I speak to the House from a place of experience that has allowed me to arrive at some fundamental conclusions. And one of those conclusions, Mr. Speaker, is that the people of Nova Scotia want profound education reform from our P-12 system. They do not want an implementation of a new program at a time when our system is destabilized and in crisis. I've learned also, Mr. Speaker, as a former classroom teacher, that leadership is about listening. It is about finding common ground and solving problems in order to maximize the common good. I suggest this government heed that advice. Listen to Nova Scotians as to what they want you to emphasize in our education system. I have great concern that this government, Mr. Speaker, has failed to listen to the 9,300 experts in the province, our teachers, and they have set out on a course that ignores problems in our systems that require leadership and action now. Mr. Speaker, I cannot support a bill that introduces new programming when the timing is improper, when it has been poorly planned and executed, and is being implemented at a time when Nova Scotian parents with students with diverse needs require our help and assistance now. Mr. Speaker, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. Planning and preparation is critical. I suggest this government reflect long and hard on the meaning of that statement and its significance to education policy in our province. And as a former teacher, I am more than happy to provide some extra help if you require understanding the quote. And of course, Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I take my leave and hope this government rethinks its priorities as it pertains to education in our province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to the pre-primary bill on third reading. There are a number of things that I'd like to say, although I'll also point out that a number of things have already been said. I think we're all fairly clear on our rather universal disappointment, as the member for Dartmouth East pointed out, in a number of aspects of the way that this has come before this House. Consultation, implementation, the impact on the overall childcare landscape, and a number of other areas, and I'll go through those briefly. In terms of consultation, the only thing we've heard about the pre-primary bill, Mr. Speaker, is that there is consultation planned. And for a program that, by the government's own admission, is world-changing for the 4-year-olds of this province, it strikes me as odd that there would not have been any meaningful consultation undertaken before this bill. Now, I don't have an analogy around sharpening an axe, but I do have an experience working in many settings as a facilitator of consultation processes. And you know what? They're hard. Consultation is challenging. And it is of no surprise to me, nor to anyone else in this House, many of you have been here a lot longer than I have, that a government might decide that it was expedient to remove that process from bringing a bill forward. It's the longest, it's the messiest, and it's the one that's most likely to challenge the assumptions of the author of any project, because it necessitates that you hear dissenting views. But as has been said in many different ways in this House at many different points of this debate, this is about education. That's what we do in education. We teach children how to listen. We teach children about how to have respectful debate, about how to be open-minded. When we look around in the world today at the divisiveness and challenges that we face as a society, Mr. Speaker, I would submit that the core skill that we need, especially in this House, but in our society, is the skill, the ability, the appetite for consultation. And so it's frankly deeply disappointing that there was no consultation on this bill before it came before us. And leave the bill aside, that there was no consultation on the program itself. I'll move from there to implementation. And I can't say a lot about implementation, Mr. Speaker, because the implementation process was shrouded in secrecy. We were told nothing about the implementation or the start date of this program until it had already begun. Every single one of us in this House, I suspect, Mr. Speaker, had phone calls from constituents asking us what was going on, many of whom were excited at the prospect of pre-primary. They wanted their children to have access to education, but they had no idea. And you can imagine, and I can certainly imagine, Mr. Speaker, as a parent, how unsettling that would be to be told that there was a promise of this great hope for the future of our children, sign on the dotted line. We can't tell you when it's going to start. We can't tell you what it's going to be like. We can't even tell you what will there be washrooms? We don't know. Will there be furniture? We don't know. How many teachers? We're not sure. Just send your kids to us. Mr. Speaker, I submit that this is a very sloppy way to go about instituting a program, particularly a universal program. And further to that point, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to raise what clearly is a bit of a sensitive topic for the minister, and that's the topic of inclusion, which my colleague touched on briefly. Mr. Speaker, when I rose in this House to ask my very first question, I asked the minister how he could guarantee us that this program was inclusive when we know that we don't know how to do inclusion. This government has appointed, by all means, knowledgeable and expert commission to spend a year figuring out how we do inclusion. We don't know how. This government created a report not a year ago that specifically said that the early childhood education program in this province does not do inclusion well. So taking those two things into account, Mr. Speaker, it's very difficult to understand how I could be accused of misleading this House and misleading the public by suggesting that this program may not, in fact, be inclusive. And subsequently, we've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence to say that it, in fact, is not inclusive. And I'll move from there to the impact on the childcare landscape as a whole, because as I just mentioned, we have a report that's very recent that tells us about all the gaps in early childhood education in this province. There are a number of challenges we have. The minister has repeatedly told us that there are only spaces for 25% of children in this province to be in regulated childcare. What the minister doesn't tell us is that by introducing this program at this time in this way, those 25% of spaces are in fact threatened, Mr. Speaker. We may have fewer than those in a month or in 2 months. And we've heard this from early childhood educators around the province, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should inexorably delay a new program so that we can protect a particular childcare provider's right to hang up a shingle and keep their space open. I think, you know, as a firm adherent to the notion of universal childcare, I, unlike my colleagues, will reluctantly support this bill because I think at least it's a first step. I'm sorry to disappoint my colleague over here. However, I'll say that we have grave concerns about the impact on the childcare landscape. It's not just the number of spaces that are available, Mr. Speaker, but it's the ability for those few remaining spaces to stay open. That's about poaching staff. We don't have enough ECEs in the province. That's about children. Because of the shroud of secrecy around which this program was launched, many of these childcare providers were given less than a month's notice before whole cohorts of children were pulled from their program. With more notice, Mr. Speaker, they could have adapted their programming model. They could have provided wraparound care. They could have added more spots for infants, which I think is something that's very important. They weren't given the time, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding all of that, they are waiting, the early childhood educators in this province and the daycare operators are waiting for a new funding model. They have been waiting, they have been promised. Right now, as I've said on the floor of this House before, they have a wage floor and they have a fee ceiling. They have a specific amount of money that they are able to use to operate, and in many cases around this province, those facilities are operating at a deficit. And it's a deficit that has been imposed by this government because they have not introduced a new funding formula. So I would hope, Mr. Speaker, that this government would take the opportunity at the very earliest convenience to address the number of outstanding issues with the remainder of the early childhood education system. I read over this bill again about 10 minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, in anticipation of this conversation, and something really popped out at me. I'm not sure if this has come to the attention of the members of this House, but as we all know, there's an administrative review going on of the entire education system. And one of the rumblings we've been hearing, given this government's appetite for amalgamation, is that the results of this review may in fact be an amalgamation of the school boards. So I reread with interest the parts of this bill that give a great deal of authority to the minister to enter into agreements to run pre-primary. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, and I suspect he will, if the minister might speak to this when we close debate on this topic. Because I find it strange, after we've heard so many times on the floor of this House about how the minister can't really answer certain questions because that's up to the school boards. It's up to the school boards to set wages. It's up to the school boards to do a number of details in rolling out this program, and yet, will there be school boards there to administer? It's kind of a brilliant strategy when you think about it, Mr. Speaker. Give all the dirty work to the school boards, then put them out of a job. Let's see, is that what's going to happen? Time will tell. Time will tell. Time will tell. In closing, Mr. Speaker, like the member from Dartmouth East, I would just like to say that I also don't come at this issue from an abstract position. This isn't an academic exercise for me. I have 3 of my own children. 1 is in a regulated daycare. 2 are in a public school in this province. I speak to teachers, early childhood educators, parents, and children every single day. This is my other job, as I like to say, when I go home from here. And for those of you without children in this House, I envy you that you have one job, as big as it might be. But the reality is that this very much impacts my daily life and those of a lot of people around me. And further, I have a nephew who lives with autism. And he is so often at the front of my mind in these conversations, partly because he's related to me, but partly because we all know that it's through proximity that we often become sensitized, or ought to become sensitized, to the issues that are most important to us. So, Mr. Speaker, I would close by saying that as a mother, as a person, as a member of the NDP, I support universal childcare. To that end, I very much hope that this is a first step, but as first steps go, it's pretty flawed.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleasure to rise today and continue the discussion we started off talking about things that are sharp and sharp items and what they might be used for. I was thinking last night when the member from Halifax Chebucto referred to a colleague opposite his speech as being absent wisdom. In that instance, it struck me as something that's an expression that could be used quite frequently in this chamber. But in terms of sharp items and sharp, witty comebacks and things like that, everyone in this chamber is trying to do that, and there is something flattering about a clever, witty put-down. And Nova Scotians, they have a great sense of humor, and they appreciate sharp wit. But it was not lost on me that even with a stable of highly paid lawyers, paid for by the taxpayers, this government, on this bill, could only accuse me of saying something and then attaching the clip to prove that I didn't say what they accused me of saying. And if this government can't even do a clever, sharp cut at somebody with any degree of competence, how can we expect them to pass legislation with that is competent? So I look forward to educating our government on how to do these issues with some style and grace. But it knows it's. But I do want to share something with the minister that I'm sure the minister probably doesn't know, and that is back in 2010, the Kids First Association completed a study involving 16 communities across Canada. And one community that took part in this study was the Pictou, Antigonish, Guysborough catchment area. In that catchment area, there's 14 schools within that, at that time, the Celtic family of the CCRSB. And it was also 9 schools within a straight regional school board. And the focus of this study was primary students in the 2007-2008 school year. And the study is an excellent one. And the results of the study suggest, as we have been saying many times in this chamber, that there are a number of problems that need addressing in the P-12 system. And those issues should take precedence over the rollout of pre-primary. And that's basically what we're talking about here, is prioritizing and looking at things that should take precedence. Now, here are a few of the findings of the study, Mr. Speaker, and they may interest the minister if he's interested in a fact-based approach. 88% of the kids in that Pictou, Antigonish, Guysborough area were deemed on track for language and cognitive development when they arrived in primary classes. 88% of them were on track when they arrived at school. And the kids had an above average scores on receptive vocabulary, number knowledge, and pre-literacy skills. It had the kids in this particular catchment area, the students in this area, there was fewer children with low scores on these three measures of receptive vocabulary, number knowledge, and pre-literacy skills. And that was those kids were above the average nationwide. So, in other words, Mr. Speaker, in the area of language and cognitive development, 36% of the kids were very ready for school, 52% were ready, and only 7%, I say only, it's not the right use of the word only because it's still 7% were at risk and 5% were vulnerable. Now, of course, nobody wants to see that in any children, but the vast majority were ready to enter school. The vast majority were ready to enter school. And now, why do I share this? Why do I share this, Mr. Speaker? Because once they're in the school system, the numbers showed that by grade 4, 2 in 10, a full 20%, required significant adaptations, required an IPP, required boosts to bring them closer to expected levels of academic performance. Mr. Speaker, the problems grow as the kids grow through the education system. The education system, we need to address the issues that are in the system so that when they're in school, they're getting the proper education that they deserve. You don't need to do it earlier. We need to fix what's there. And that's kind of the main thrust of the argument I've been trying to make to the government. And the government's not been receptive to that argument because they have their own political agenda that they're putting in front of the education of children. And that's what this is all about. It's the typical bait and switch referred to, where don't look here, look over there. Don't look at all the issues in the P-12 system. Look over here at this pre-primary. And that is not good government, and it's not good for the education system. Mr. Speaker, I would urge the minister to read this report. It's only 31 pages, and it will certainly give him some recent local statistics, probably open his eyes a little bit to the issues that we're talking about here. Now, Mr. Speaker, you may remember the Freeman report. It's another in a long line of reports that haven't got much airtime with the government. But the Freeman report says at the time of the Freeman report, if you look at the administration group, administrators were a group that 72 or 73% of the people in the administration group thought that the programs being offered students in the school system were appropriate for preparing students for the next year or for life. 72% of administrators thought the programs were appropriate for preparing students. If you go outside of the administration group and go to the teacher group, 52%. Imagine that, Mr. Speaker. 52% of teachers thought that the programs being delivered in the school system were appropriate for preparing students for the next year. And if you go one step further, I think you know what the results would tell you when you ask the general community. The Freeman panel found that 33% of community members thought that the school system was properly preparing students for the next level. Those are pretty disturbing numbers, and they're disturbing in the sense, the more disturbing part is that the government is ignoring those numbers. The government has an opportunity to look at the P-12 system, make the investments, make the changes, and improve those numbers. But instead, we haven't seen that. Instead, we've seen that discussion put off and another discussion initiated with the pre-primary. And I know that we're seeing now, even with the Commission on Inclusion, and I do want to talk about the Commission on Inclusion a little bit, but we're now even seeing that the work of the Commission, the topic of inclusion in general, is being pushed aside as school boards and administrators start to turn their minds to the review of the administration and governance. There's a lot going on in education, Mr. Speaker, and it's all just a big cover design for the fact that this government is not prepared to address any of the issues that exist in the system as we know it today. There's always something new being added, just to confuse and distract. And that's the real shame of it, because things continue to get kicked further down the road. And I'm worried that the issue of inclusion and the work of that commission will get kicked further down the road as well, because there's no word yet. There's no word yet on the consultation process for that Commission on Inclusion. No word on public consultations, no word on how do you provide feedback to that commission. Nothing. Because the minister is more interested in a headline than results. So that's the real issue. And it's hard to say that this commission will be able to do a very robust job, robust work. I hope they can. I hope they can, but there's a number of studies out there. Wayne McKay's 2006 study on inclusion, I think he did that for New Brunswick, is a very powerful the study as well. So we can talk about the Commission on Inclusion. I hope they do good work. Their final report's due in March. I believe it's March. There's supposed to be maybe an interim report come out in January. But nothing on consultations yet. So where is that going to go? And now we have boards and administrators preoccupied with another study. When I look at what's happening in the education file, I think about all the talk about the federal tax changes and the term that is now very common in the vocabulary of Canadians called income sprinkling. There's a lot of chat about income sprinkling. And I look at this government and I see this government is in the business of effort sprinkling. They're effort sprinklers. They don't really want to roll up their sleeves and put the effort in on the major issues. They just sprinkle the effort around a little bit here and a little bit there, without really any progress. And I do believe, and the sad thing about that is you have a little bit of effort sprinkling, a little bit of headline, and then you see everyone, the whole flock come in behind. Sometimes it strikes me as a group of hypnotized chickens, Mr. Speaker, in the way they operate. But the minister has said.
Order, please. I'm going to ask the honourable member for Pictou East to retract the phrase "hypnotized chickens," and we'll add that to our list of unparliamentary references. The honourable member for Pictou East.
So retracted, Mr. Speaker. So retracted. So retracted. The minister has often said how proud he is of his government for being the first to tackle the issue of inclusion. And I will say that with the establishment of the commission, the minister is making an effort to tackle that issue. But the minister may also know that there's a bit of an art to the science of tackling. And a tackle is not complete until the opponent is on the ground. And I would suggest that the best way to tackle an issue is low and around the knees, to really bring the opponent down and bring the issue down. And what we're seeing here with this is what we would call a high tackle. It's a high tackle, Mr. Speaker, and probably would be penalized in a lot of sports activities, because it's not appearing to be a nice, clean tackle. It's appearing to be a high tackle. And I would say, in closing, I'm happy for 818 families whose children are in this program. Terrible rollout of the program. It's good for a percentage of the population, and I'm happy for them. I take serious issue with the minister's comments about who is ultimately being benefited. And I actually think that this program, and the way it's rolled out, especially around the transportation issues, this program further marginalizes low-income Nova Scotians. It just is really hard for people. You can't leave if you can't in the rural areas. You just getting the kids to and from. And just imagine if you're fortunate to have a job and trying to leave your job to pick the child up and get them home and get back. There's way too many issues. It's just not fair to enough families. So I just wish that if this really was what this government determined as the real solution, the most urgent, pressing need in education, that they would have did it properly. And they haven't done it properly. And that's gone all the way through their communications efforts to some of their slanderous activities they take. Everything is half.
Order, please. Remind the honourable member for Pictou East, inferring the government is undertaking slanderous activities is indeed unparliamentary, and I will once again ask him to retract that statement. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Yeah, I apologize, Mr. Speaker. I will retract that statement. But there's a lot of issues with the rollout of this program. There's a lot of issues that come out of the lack of planning for this program. There's other things that should have been, and I would have prioritized and worked on, and I wish the government would have did that too. But it won't be to the issues in education won't be tackled by this bill today. They will exist. They will exist long after today, unless this government changes tact and gets down to the real nitty-gritty and brings the issues in education to the ground. We're not seeing it today. Maybe tomorrow we'll see it, Mr. Speaker. With those few words, I'll take my place.
Time to recognize the Honourable Minister of Education. It will be to close third reading of Bill number 8, the Pre-Primary Education Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance, Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments of the members opposite. I am happy that the Conservative caucus has stated very clearly that they will be opposing pre-primary in Nova Scotia, as the member for Dartmouth East has said. That is consistent with what the comments of the member from Pictou East have been, which we have talked about in this House, that they are a party that is opposed to this sort of program and early learning in the province. I will note that I have listened to the arguments opposing this bill with interest, and I would suggest that they are not sufficient from a government perspective to change course in this regard, and I do want to address those arguments one by one. I believe there was 4 primary arguments that were made, Mr. Speaker, opposing this bill. Number one, an assertion made by both parties that there has somehow been a rushed, messy rollout of this program that has not been to the benefit of the children and families that are currently accessing that. They have suggested that we have not consulted or thought about pre-primary early learning in advance of this, when in fact that's not true, Mr. Speaker. I'll remind the House and all members that we've actually had a pilot running on early learning in this province for over 4 years now. We had an early learning, inclusive early learning classrooms in 8 locations in every board across this province, Mr. Speaker. That was the pilot, 4 years of running these programs, using a play-based curriculum, ensuring that they were inclusive places for children to play and learn. And the feedback that we received from that 4 years of consultation of a pilot project was very conclusive in terms of the impact that this program was having on the lives of our kids and how helpful it was for our families. 4 years of studying early learning initiatives, Mr. Speaker. So this has not been rushed. This has not been an unthought-out process. In fact, it has been deliberate. And in the rollout, you're actually seeing it run pretty smoothly. No matter what the members here say in the House, they provided no evidence to suggest that this is messy. They haven't pointed to one single incident where there's been a problem with our children or families' ability to access this. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, if the member from Pictou East would actually chat with the superintendents, with the ECEs on the ground, working on behalf of our government to execute on this program, Mr. Speaker, he would know, and I'll quote one of our supers, the opening has gone very well. Families seem to be very pleased with the program. And staff report that the children are responding well and settling in. And I'll table that. That is a superintendent on the ground. So the member from Pictou East is right. I'm much more interested in what these people are saying on the ground than his vacuous rhetoric in this House. That is not supported by any evidence or any examples that he's presented, Mr. Speaker. I think that's important to note. So in terms of suggesting that this is rushed, messy, I actually believe that the evidence and the timeline of execution of this program defies both of those arguments very easily, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the impact on the sector, this is the primary concern for the New Democratic Party. A legitimate concern, one that we have approached with sympathy and deliberate action, Mr. Speaker. And so the member from Dartmouth South has argued that this has created an existential crisis for our childcare sector. That is absolutely not what we want to happen. In fact, we need our child sector to grow, along with pre-primary, to ensure that we're having a holistic approach to childcare and early learning in our province. We need the sector to succeed. We have a vested interest in that sector. We have increased investments in that sector year after year in our government to assist them in growing. In fact, we're in negotiations right now with the federal government that will see major investments in the very near future, on top of what we put in provincially for the childcare sector, to help it with strategically growing in our province, to help it address concerns around their ability to handle students with special needs. So these things are actually happening in tandem, Mr. Speaker. So for any member to argue that this government is not concerned about the future of the childcare sector, the fact that we've increased investments every year, the fact that we are actually negotiating a major deal with the federal government to see further investment to grow that sector and increase its capacity demonstrates that that is not the case either. Now, yes, there could be potential concerns around staffing. So far, because of the way we've approached this in a thoughtful way, for phase 1, we have only actually had, I think, 2 or 3 private providers out of 398 in the province who have said that they have had a staffing issue. I think that's less than 1%. You know, and we appreciate that that has created a concern for them. So we're working with our partners at Labour and Advanced Education and our department to help them address those recruitment issues. If you actually look at, but to suggest that we shouldn't be proceeding with this because there is some existential threat because of the labour force for ECEs is not accurate when you actually look at the facts of the matter, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I'm hearing from ECEs and those that are studying to become early childhood educators that they're actually excited about having a brand new opportunity and much more opportunity to actually pursue that field, that career, which is so critical to our kids here in the province. I'm actually hearing excitement from that sector. And as a direct result of pre-primary, we're actually seeing an increase in the uptake in our post-secondary education institutions, Mr. Speaker, who provide early childhood learning opportunities The number of our young people who are getting into this field, who are studying to become early childhood educators, is increasing. And in fact, if you look at the labor market numbers, we have, I believe, close to 2,500 registered early childhood educators that are registered in this province. The private sector or not-for-profit sector take up about 1,300 of those folks. So there's a big gap in terms of what we actually have available for skilled people in this field and the opportunities that are available for them. So we are helping bridge that gap between the actual labor market supply of early childhood educators and demand, so that these people are actually going to be able to find jobs in these fields in the province, Mr. Speaker. And I think that creates a really positive future for that sector. And thank you. The member for Pictou East has suggested that having a free, universally accessible pre-primary program actually further marginalizes low-income families. That is an argument I think we can simply defy based on logic, Mr. Speaker. Right now, families actually are having a financial barrier put in front of them to access child care, despite the fact that we're subsidizing the rates. They're still having a hard time because it's not available either geographically or they just simply can't afford it. Providing a free program for families that everybody will be able to access, that will be available in every single community, actually helps increase the access to these critical learning initiatives for our low-income families in particular, Mr. Speaker, who we also know might have children that need these supports a little more than others. So that is something I'm very proud of as well. The final argument that has been put forward to suggest that this House should reconsider its course of action in pre-primary is in relation to the P-12 system. Members have, I think, very well articulated concerns that exist in the P-12 system. There's issues there that we all recognize are problems for teachers, for kids, for families. There are students with special needs that aren't getting what they need out of the system. There are kids who are high achievers who aren't getting what they need out of the system. And so we do need transformative changes to happen in our P-12 system to help all those folks, to make life better for teachers, to help them focus on what's important, which is teaching, and to make sure our kids are getting what they need. We are endeavoring to tackle those major challenges. So as the members even mentioned in their own statements, we've brought together a group of experts to help us tackle the system of inclusion, to bring forward recommendations and a blueprint to help us transform that system so it's working better for everybody. We are working with teachers directly through the Council to Improve Classroom Conditions, so they, for the first time in the province's history, are writing policies and setting direction and allocating resources in areas that they believe are important. And we've already seen the establishment of a first provincial province-wide attendance policy, which we're already hearing from principals has had an impact on student attendance already in less than a month. That's because teachers are doing this. They're tackling the issue of reporting, of assessments, of evaluation, figuring out how to get rid of all the erroneous paperwork that they've been asked to do over the years so that they can focus on teaching, Mr. Speaker. So these things are happening to improve outcomes for our kids, to make sure the system is better geared towards them. We are also looking at the administrative model. We're taking on a lot because we do have a lot of challenges. We're looking at the way that we govern ourselves in the Department of Education, how we make our decisions, our relationships with the boards, how they operate. Are all the resources we're using from an administrative perspective having the impact that we want on the system and on our kids? Is the money getting to where it needs? So yeah, we're looking at that. We're looking at all these things with one intent, to make sure our kids do better, so that our education system can better prepare them to lead successful lives. And early learning is an essential part of that. While the members argue that we should disregard early learning until we figure out the P-12 system, that does not take into consideration the evidence, Mr. Speaker, that points to the fact that early learning is part of the solution to our P-12 system, Mr. Speaker. Children that attend pre-primary, and there's a plethora of evidence on this. I'm happy to read the report that the member from Pictou East has tabled. I will take up that challenge, and I will look through that report, and I'm sure it'll be very informative, Mr. Speaker. But I'll also ask that member to read the plethora of conclusive evidence that has been, and research that has been done in the UK, in other countries in Europe, in Canada, Ontario, in the USA, which all point to the fact that kids that enter into a pre-primary system do better cognitively, socially, emotionally. They have less behavioral problems. Challenges that we're hearing from teachers are creating issues in the classroom. This helps ensure that our kids get a better start, to have better outcomes there, Mr. Speaker. So we have to see early learning as part of the solution here. The fact that we're investing $50 million when this is at its full capacity will actually have dividends, Mr. Speaker, within the system and outside of the system. And I will read some of the findings there just to remind the House. Early childhood education children perform on average better than other children by age 15. That's from a study in the UK, which also concluded that in a universal early learning program, play-based environment guided by a well-defined curriculum and trained educators is a major game changer for their kids. Extensive longitudinal research in the UK points to significant academic and social-emotional benefits for every year of preschool. And the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in the Nordic countries, who offer full daycare programs to most younger children with play-based learning, they lead the world in literacy, numeracy, and science outcomes in later school years, Mr. Speaker. The facts are absolutely incredible on this. And while a universal approach costs more than a targeted approach, it is likely to produce benefits that exceed the additional costs, Mr. Speaker. The evidence is conclusive on this. And if you consider the evidence, you know that this is part of the solution to the broader challenges that we're having in our education system. That is why this government will proudly forge ahead, not waste a single day, Mr. Speaker, because we know that a brighter start for our kids means a brighter future for us all. Thank you very much. And with that, I move third reading of Bill number 8, Pre-Primary Education Act.
The motion is for third reading of Bill number 8, the Pre-Primary Education Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary-minded, nay? Nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 8, an act to amend Chapter 44 of the Acts of 2005, the Pre-Primary Education Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed.